This is, in fact, a special edition of Facing the Future. We're discussing the kickoff of a project called The Shape of Things to Come. GAI and Concord have joined forces to produce this quarterly issue brief series that explores the fiscal, economic, social, and geopolitical implications of the aging of America. The first issue brief in this series is called America's Demographic Future. It's being released this week, and it's the topic of our discussion today. So I think we'll kick it off with you first, Bob. Can you give a little more background for our listeners on this project, its purpose, and why it's important to have this discussion right now?
Well, first, let me say what a pleasure it is to be working with Richard Jackson again. He co-authored with his colleague Neil Howe a series called Facing Facts back in the 90s and through around 2010 or so, I guess, Richard. And it really was central to the Concord Coalition in those years. So it's a pleasure to be working with Richard again. This made a lot of sense because last year, the Concord Coalition started a project on looking at a fiscally responsible economic growth agenda. And we wanted to look beyond just how can you raise taxes and cut spending and, do that? There's some underlying factors having to do with the economy and the budget that needed, some special attention. And one of them is the demographic challenge, because it really has to do with economic growth, and it has to do with the budget. As the population ages, it's obviously putting a pressure on some of the federal budget programs that are already the largest, like Medicare and Social Security, and yet the aging of the population has economic effects as well, and that contributes to the long-term fiscal challenge. So I've stayed in touch with Richard all these years, and he's been working mostly on global aging issues. But we decided back towards the end of last year that it might be good to collaborate again on this project.
Yeah, it's great to be working with you again, Bob.
Well, I'm excited for this series. I fall squarely in the millennial category of this generational flux or transition we're seeing across our country. And I'm excited to hear what you have to say, Richard, about how those trends might even affect things like the economy or our healthcare system or my future retirement. That being said, what can we expect in terms of topics for this specific series? And then maybe jump into some of the key findings in this particular paper, and we'll go from there.
The United States, like the rest of the developed world, is in the midst of a stunning demographic transformation. As recently as 1990, only 1 in 10 Americans were age 65 and over. But by 2050, that's going to be more than 1 in 5. So it's a pretty big, substantial demographic shift. There are two forces behind the aging of the population. The first force is falling fertility. People, in particular women, are having fewer babies, and this decreases the relative number of young in the population. The second force is rising life expectancy. People are living longer, and this increases the relative number of old. So there are two forces behind population aging, and there are two big consequences. The first consequence is a rising fiscal burden. Graying means paying. It means paying more for pensions, more for health care, more for long-term care for the frail elderly. The second consequence is economic. America and other developed countries are not only aging, the age structure of the population is not only shifting upward, they also will have more slowly growing populations, or in many countries, even contracting populations, and particularly more slowly growing or contracting working age populations. Slower growth in the working age population will translate through to slower growth in employment, which will in turn translate through to slower growth in GDP. So there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is that America is actually due to age substantially less than many other developed countries. While the elderly share of the US population is currently projected to reach 22% by 2050, the average elderly share in Europe will be 28%, and in Japan, it will be 36 or 37 or 38%. So we are not due to age as much, but the US demographic outlook is deteriorating. Over the past few decades, up until the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, we had a relatively high fertility rate. It was very close to the so-called replacement level of 2.1, which is the level needed to maintain a stable population from one generation to the next. Fertility has fallen fairly dramatically since then. In 2018, the most recent year for which we have data, the fertility rate, total fertility rate, to use the technical term, had dropped to 1.7, the lowest level on record. Meanwhile, net immigration, which in the near term acts much like a higher fertility rate, has also fallen. So the result is that if these recent developments aren't reversed, the United States could well age significantly more than is currently projected by the US Census Bureau, by the UN, or by the Social Security Administration. The United States, moreover, had in the early post-war decades an unusually large baby boom. The fertility rate spiked almost everywhere in the rich world following the Second World War, but it spiked much higher than almost anywhere else in the United States. So up until around 2010, the passage of our unusually large baby boom generation across the life cycle from childhood through young adulthood into middle age was actually slowing the aging of the population. Since 2010, it's been accelerating it. So even though we're not due to age as much as many other developed countries, we're aging with a bag. So the resulting fiscal and economic shock could be large. That's the short version. Well, one more point, just to close it out. The aging of the US population is inevitable. It's baked in the cake. The prospects for higher fertility look dim at this point. Many demographers had been hoping that the decline in fertility following the Great Recession was just due to the fact that millennials, because of the tough job market and difficulties launching careers and establishing independent households, that they were just putting off having births, that it was a so-called tempo effect, and that the birth rate would come back up. But that hasn't happened yet. And given the pandemic, it's unlikely to happen anytime soon, because if history teaches anything about pandemics, it's that they tend to depress fertility at least for a while. And even if fertility were to surge, it takes 20, 25 years to turn a newborn baby into a productive worker. So the aging is baked in the cake, but fiscal and economic catastrophe is not. There will inevitably be some extra fiscal burden. There will inevitably be some drag on economic growth, but the extent of the burden and the extent of the drag will depend critically on policy choices that we make. Hence the series. In subsequent issues, well, we haven't charted out all of them yet, but the next one is going to be about the potential benefits, fiscal, economic, and personal, of higher labor force participation rates at older ages. So extending work lives.